Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture on Chapter 14 Presenting Your Research. This is also going to be our last lecture of the course. I know it feels like this time together has just flown by, and it really has. So I hope you enjoy this last lecture because I've enjoyed having all of you in class. So let's get into a little bit more on what it means to present your research. Because up until this point in this class, we've really only been talking about what it is to conduct research and how to conduct research. But really, that's only one stage of research as a whole because presenting our research is really what disseminates our research. It's what gets our research out there to a larger audience. In fact, some might say that presenting your own research study is perhaps just as important as is conducting it, because this presentation is how most people will be able to understand the procedures, discuss results, offer feedback, and take the work that you did a step further. That's really what sort of opens the door for replication and the advancement of our current research base. Also, presentations are crucial in spreading the word about your work. And if you do a presentation well, that presentation can open the door to additional opportunities for you, such as presenting your research at regional and national conferences, going on to publish a journal article, or even pursuing related research topics in your graduate work, whether that is here at CSU or in another graduate degree that you pursue. And there are many different things that you can do while presenting your research to help streamline your presentation. One of those is to identify the main points. So when you think about your entire project or when you're presenting your project, think about the entire project first rather than going into a PowerPoint project or PowerPoint slide right away. That tends to be the most frequent starting point for presenting your research is like, oh, I'm just going to open a PowerPoint or a Google Slides and I'm going to start typing in. And really, what we recommend is that instead of opening that PowerPoint right away, you really take a step back and think about your entire project as a whole. Think about that. And from there, you will start to understand what you really need to present on, what the most important points are to focus on in your study. Because you're going to provide information about the study's background, the literature review, the methodology, results, and discussion points, but you will be the person who gets to determine which of these points is the most important to focus on because the focus is going to be different from each study. What I choose to focus on in the presentation of my own results is likely going to be different from yours because we're conducting different studies. And for some studies, the results are the most important thing. For other studies, you really want to talk about the results, but you really can't do that unless you give credence to the methodology because maybe your methodology is what's innovative and new, or maybe your analytic plan is what is new. And really, it is this sort of perspective of identifying the main points, this zooming out, as one might say, that really opens the door for us to be able to understand what those main things are that we want to convey to our audience. Another thing that you'll want to do when you are presenting your research to an audience is to rank the topics of importance in your study. So I like to tell people that you want to identify 3 to 4 points that will define your research. So the 3 to 4 main points that you want people who talk to you about your research project to take away from that conversation, that they'll remember hours down the road, days, weeks, however long it is. That's the main thing that you want them to remember. And once you've identified those 3 to 4 main points, then consider how much time you want to spend on each of those main points or each of those aspects. Because that is what's going to give you almost like a timeline of how you present your research, how much you're going to be spending on your research topics. And we say timelines because if you were really passionate about your own research topic, you could probably get up there and present it to people for an hour and be unfazed. but the audience members might not be that into it. So you want to give yourselves that optimal amount of time where you're not rushing through your findings, but you're also not dragging things out. So ranking your topics helps to provide some structure to that presentation. And you're also going to need to provide background information to put the study and its concepts in context for what you are doing. But do not provide so many details on the literature review when you really should be focusing on your study's findings. This is a really easy mistake to make when you're presenting your research findings to an audience. We want to really delve into everything that we did and how we led up to the research that we're doing. But when you're presenting research, you don't need as heavy of an influence on the literature review, because a lot of times the audience that you are presenting to is assumed to have some amount of experience in the topic that you are presenting on. So you can bypass this detailed literature review and instead have a much more abbreviated literature review, and then instead focus more heavily on your research findings. Another thing that you can do in presenting your research findings to an audience is incorporating a relevant story that captures the essence of your study. And we do this because when we tell a story through our research, we are able to better capture the audience's attention while we are presenting. Things like statistics and even just seeing a plethora of words on a screen can be enough to lose an audience when you're presenting your research findings. So, taking this format of telling a story provides you with an opportunity to really grasp and invite people into the story that is this research project that you have spent so much time on. And while your story is attention grabbing, you also need to establish that your work is professional, ethical, and thoughtful. So, when you're presenting your research findings to an audience, you need to briefly mention what the literature offers, what hypotheses you proposed, and the relationships that you were investigating. And when you're doing this, you want to be succinct about your methodology. You really want to start with the ethical considerations and safeguards that were put in place to protect the anonymity of your participants. That is going to be a huge component of your methodology. Talk about how you protected the identity and the safety of your participants, and then move into how your data was discussed, the number of participants that you had, and the participant demographics. You may also find that the presentation sort of flows naturally if you next address the findings of your research study after you've identified these data collection pieces. And when you're going through your findings, you will revisit the hypotheses and state during that conversation of the hypotheses whether you were able to reject or you failed to reject the null hypothesis. So you're really going to have this framework around your hypotheses that really streamlines the presentation for you. And another thing to keep in mind when you're presenting your research is that visual aids are your friend. Oftentimes, visual aids will help to convey what you want the audience to learn from your study. But it's important to keep in mind that they are not the focus of your presentation. What you are saying should be the focus of the presentation. The visual aids are just that. They are a visual focal point to aid what you are verbally saying so that they support and provide context to the things that you are saying. And the type of visual aid should fit the need of your study. So this is really broad, but if you remember back in earlier chapters, we talked about different ways to visually display and data visualization techniques that you can use. And really, you get your choice depending on what type of study you're doing, what type of results you're trying to convey, and even if you're trying to convey results for just a single variable or multiple variables. But really, in addition to those visual aids, it's always good practice to use minimal text and have tables, graphs, figures, and illustrations of your findings. That is like your best case scenario, because if you just have words written out to say your findings, like we found that this variable did not predict this variable. If you have that written out on your slide, people are going to zone out when you're presenting your findings. But if you're able to graphically display that through a figure, an illustration, a table, whatever it is, that gets people's sort of visual needs met while they are listening to your conversation. And then again, it's a visual aid. So you're still saying those things out loud so you can accommodate everyone's approach to listening to your findings or to attending your presentation. And then also, it's important to keep in mind some just practical tips of presenting your research findings. For starters, the tone of your voice and your body language when you address an audience are important in order for you to make an effective presentation. So it really helps to make eye contact and to smile at the audience. And sometimes it can feel really awkward to smile at the audience, especially if you don't know anyone who's there. Sometimes it's even more awkward when you know someone who's in the audience. But it is helpful in being able to connect with your audience if you're able to pick people out in the crowd, make eye contact with them, and smile. And eventually, if you do it enough, if you're making that eye contact and you're smiling, it tends to feel a little bit more natural, or at least seem a little bit less forced. But also, you want to make sure that you keep your voice strong and calm while taking pauses as you speak, giving your audience an opportunity to catch up, to ponder what you're saying, to sit with the things that you are presenting before you move on. You don't want to go too fast, because if you rush through your presentation, your audience members are going to get easily distracted, and they're going to possibly get even a little bit anxious listening to you. But you also don't want to go too slow through your findings, because if you go slow, you're going to lose interest. Your audience is going to lose interest and they're not going to want to pay attention. And also, I know that this seems obvious and it makes a big difference when you're presenting research, but make sure that you dress appropriately and you stand up straight and use good posture. Make sure that you are presenting yourself in the best way possible, whatever that is. Dress in a way that you feel comfortable and powerful and knowledgeable and competent, and speak in a way that makes the most sense for you. Move in a way that is consistent with how you operate in the world. I love to use this example as well, because a lot of times when you're presenting research, a lot of people automatically jump to, oh, there's like a podium in front of the room and my computer's there and I'm just going to stand behind the podium and I'm going to read off of the slides. But really, what you're doing is you're creating a physical barrier between you and your audience with that podium, even sometimes with just your laptop. So I always encourage people, when you're thinking about presenting your research findings, use the whole space. If you have a front room or you have a stage or some elevated area that you are in the front of, use that space. Move around if it feels frequently. Move out in front of the podium. Really just give yourself an opportunity to connect with your audience as much as possible. So, if you present your findings to an audience, probably the most frequent presentation that you're going to do is to classmates. We do a lot of presenting of our research findings in graduate school to one another. But there are other ways that you can present your research findings to other people. And one of those is by applying to conferences. Local universities typically host conferences that are open to their current students, and CSU does that as well. CSU has conferences at the university that are open to all graduate students across CSU, where you can come and present your research findings to other graduate students and to faculty in other departments, and also to undergrads who are attending and want to know what type of research graduate students are doing. But you also have the option to apply to regional conferences. And these regional conferences can help to hone your presentation skills and to prepare you for the next step, which is the national conferences. And these regional conferences tend to be a little bit smaller and a little bit more focused. So oftentimes regional conferences tend to have a much more narrow sort of subject or interest pool that allows you to really hone your skills to that group. And you, as students, will likely hear about regional conferences from the MAC faculty and through the MAC listserv, including the alumni listserv. There are still regional conference information that gets sent out on the alumni listserv, so make sure you're paying attention to that if you want to present research in the future. And then, as I've already previewed, there are national conferences. National conferences tend to be more competitive and usually only accept a number of poster presentations every year and oral presentations. And in total, it tends to be a little bit easier to get a poster presentation accepted than it does to get an oral presentation accepted, but that largely depends on the conference. But overall, national conferences tend to be more competitive and the spots tend to be a little bit more limited. So, if you're interested in applying to conferences, poster presentations are a great option because the poster presentations are typically located in a separate area at a pre scheduled time, and these poster presentations are very well attended. So, the way that it works is that you have a bunch of people who all show up with a research poster, and these posters are huge. They're like 4 feet by 3 feet, and they're put up on these walls or these boards of some sort, and then hundreds of people, depending on the size of the conference, will rotate through the room and look at your poster. And if they find your poster interesting, they'll stop and they'll talk to you. And they'll ask you questions, and they will ask you where you're from and what sort of research you're planning to do next and how they can learn more about your research and all those sorts of things. So, because they are so well attended, poster presentations also afford an excellent opportunity to network with other students who are also invested in research, might even be research that's similar to yours, and it's an opportunity for you to talk with other professors from other universities, other departments, depending on the size of your conference, and really get acquainted with who is out there in the world. And students who are interested in pursuing additional graduate degrees should take advantage of this networking opportunity at poster presentations, as well as many other opportunities and resources that are available at national conferences. Specifically, when you go to national conferences, other universities tend to have a pretty good showing, so you get an opportunity to talk with current students and faculty at that university to ask them what it's like to go there, what sort of research they're doing, and to really just get a feel for what is necessary for you to be accepted into that program should you decide to pursue an additional graduate degree. And say you've already applied to conferences and you've already presented your research, you might be wondering what else is left. And there is something left. Namely, you can think about publishing an article. Because publishing an article is another way for you to reach the scientific community on your topic of interest. Typically, when you are publishing a journal, you are going to publish to a journal that is specific to your field. So if you're presenting on substance use research, you're going to submit to substance use journals. If you're interested in emotions, then you might apply for an emotional journal. You'll see what I mean a little bit here. If you ever do research on journals and you see the journal names, you'll see that they're pretty descriptive in narrowing down the field that they are really focused on. But most journals are peer reviewed, which means that other experts in the field read and consider the articles that are approved and published in that journal and then approve them before they are published. When a journal is peer reviewed, it means that it is ensuring a higher quality of article with a sound methodology. So the fact that when you apply to a peer-reviewed journal that your article has to go through multiple people and be approved by multiple people multiple times, it is really just saying that you have produced a high quality article and that you met the standards to get into that journal. And then that means that your article is pretty robust. But it's also important to keep in mind that there are writing standards to keep in mind when you're trying to publish your work. So let's go into a little bit more detail on those writing standards. So there are many different things that have to be considered to be published in a research journal. And these are things that the editors and the reviewers at the journal, and then subsequently the author themselves of the article has to sort of consider when attempting to publish their research study in a journal. And one of those first pieces to consider is the relevance of the problem. So when you are conducting a research study, the focus of your study should be on an interest that is to a broad audience. You want to pick a research study that's important to you, that's fascinating to you, but you also want it to be applicable to other people. Are other people interested in this? If you are the only person in the world who is interested in that topic, then your chances of that article being published are a little bit slimmer. But if you have picked an article and you have identified a topic that is of relevance to a broad audience, you are more likely to be considered for publication. Another component that is considered is your writing style as an author, as I've already mentioned. Writing is a learned skill and will improve every time you practice writing more. But there are some simple practices that you can use to improve your writing style. And some of those practices include reading scientific articles and books to familiarize yourself with styles, commonly used phrases, and even writing with clarity. You can get really solid examples of how to write scientifically the more you read scientific articles. It also helps to write every day just to get practice. And it also helps to think ahead about the design of your study and the presentation of your work. If you can go into writing with a solid sort of design and plan in place, you can streamline your writing process. And the more you write and the more you practice, the better you're going to get at avoiding unnecessary information and unnecessary words. It is so easy at times to overshare in our research. We just put everything out on the paper and we don't always need to. And the more you practice writing research articles and really writing from an empirical standpoint, the easier it becomes to avoid some of this unnecessary information. Reviewers will also consider the type of methodology that's used and whether that methodology is appropriate for the study that you have conducted. So when you have reviewers and editors looking at your research article, they're going to be looking at whether or not you chose a robust design, that it holds up and can be supported, but also that it was appropriate given the type of study that you were conducting, the hypotheses that you proposed. And finally, and additionally, the quality of your literature review will also play a factor in determining if your article will be considered for publication. Your literature article is really a reflection of your familiarity with the work of other researchers in the field. And the more familiar you are with that previous work, the better you are going to look to the editors, to the reviewers, because you have said, I did my research. I know what is out there and why I'm presenting my research study. In essence, a great literature review sets the tone for a great study because the reader can see that you have comprehensively covered the topic and are well acquainted with the research that or with the literature that is available on that topic. And finally, the last thing that's going to be considered by editors and reviewers is your sample size. And this is really important because having only a small number of participants can limit the impact of any study. A larger sample size results in a study that has stronger validity and stronger reliability. And this is important both in quantitative and in qualitative studies. It tends to be more discussed in quantitative studies, as you can even remember when I was going over the analysis options that you had for quantitative studies. I would point out occasionally which ones were really amenable, or not necessarily amenable, but were really focused, not focused, but were really sensitive to your sample size, and ones where if you have a larger sample, this score is going to do better. In qualitative studies, that's still important. Sample size still matters, but it will largely depend on the topic of study and how difficult it is to recruit the population of interest. And that is how sample size is almost sort of evaluated by publishing companies and by editors and reviewers in qualitative studies. So that's where we are going to end our conversation on chapter 15. So I want to end this lecture by talking a little bit more about your final writing assignment for this course, which is the final research prospectus. So this document is going to be due at 11:59 p.m. on the Sunday of week 8. And as I've already briefly mentioned, this is your final writing assignment for the course, which is fantastic because you have put in so much hard work this semester. I know this course is fast and you're doing fantastic in keeping up with it. So this is the last one, and hopefully it feels a little bit easier because you've done a lot of the work already. In fact, the final research prospectus is going to be a combination of all 4 previous chapters that you already wrote put into one comprehensive document that also includes just some small additional components. So those additional components are things that you might have already incorporated in previous chapter drafts, but they need to be included in your final research prospectus. So those additional components can include a title page, an APA style running header and page number, a table of contents, the abstract for your article. Then you'll have chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then the additional component is your references, making sure that each reference has a hanging indent. You're also expected to, throughout this document, throughout this final research prospectus, to adhere to APA style. So you need to be using Times New Roman, size 12 font, utilize only one space between sentences, have 1-inch margins all the way around, so on and so forth. If you find yourself wondering how to adhere to APA style, make sure that you look through the APA manual. This document is full of every answer to every single question that you could possibly have about APA writing. There's so much information in there, so don't hesitate to look through that document, look through that manual, and evaluate if you can answer your question on APA writing style. Also, in regards to the final research prospectus, this document is going to be worth 25 points, and you're going to be graded on 3 components. The first of those is your ability to implement the feedback that you received on previous chapter drafts that you submitted. So for each draft that you submitted previously, you were given detailed feedback. And in the final research prospectus, you need to have implemented that feedback, taken it into consideration, and expanded upon it. That ability to implement feedback is worth 10 points. You're also going to be graded on including all of the required components of the document, which is going to be including an additional 10 points. So those required components are going to be your title page, your table of contents, your abstracts, chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, and your reference list, as well as your general APA writing styles. So your running header, your page number, all of those sorts of things. And that again is worth 10 points. And then the final 5 points comes from your overall writing quality. Have you submitted a document that is well written, free of errors, has been proofread, does not have any grammar or spelling mistakes, and is easy to follow? You have full sentences, not bullet points, not incomplete sentences, so on and so forth. And again, I know I already mentioned this, but this is due at 11:59 p.m. on Sunday of week 8. If you have any questions about the feedback that you received on previous drafts or previous chapters that you submitted, please reach out, ask questions, and get the support that you need to be able to finish that assignment. And I want to end by just saying thank you for an amazing, wonderful 8 weeks together. You did absolutely fantastic in the course, and it was lovely having you in class. So, thank you for a wonderful 8 weeks, and I wish you the best.